and welcome for all of you who are watching. You're tuned into TMH as we present you our daily English news. Our headlines for today: peace talks over the Tigrayan war has entered day 2. The U.S. has urged to use its leverage to the ending of the killing in Ethiopia, and Amnesty International says there's fear of fresh atrocities looming in Tigray region as conflict intensifies within the recent weeks. As we move on to our main updates for today, peace talks over the Tigray war has entered day 2, and on Wednesday morning, several participants, including mediators, were seen by AFP reporters entering the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for the resumption of these talks. Former Nigerian President AU Envoy Olusegun Obasanjo, former South African Deputy President Fumzio Mlambo, and former Kenyan President Uhuru Kenyatta are facilitating the talks with the encouragement of the United States, whose Special Envoy Mike Hammer picked up the Tigray delegation in the U.S. military aircrafts on Sunday. Ongoing joint offensives by the Ethiopian and Eritrean forces has raised fears of further harm to civilians, leading the African, U.S., and European leaders, and even Pope Francis, to call for a ceasefire and immediate urgent talks. The Tigrayan delegations has said it is focused on the talks in South Africa would be on the immediate cessation of hostilities, unfettered access to the Tigray for humanitarian aid to enter, and the withdrawal of all Eritrean forces. The government has said it views the talks as an opportunity to resolve the conflict and to consolidate the improvement of the situation on the ground, apparently a reference to its military advances within the Tigray region. United Nations human rights investigators have recently singled out the Ethiopian government as using starvation of civilians as a weapon of war. Babies in Tigray are dying in their first month of life at 4 times the rate before the war, cutting off the access to most medical care that they need. And according to a yet unpublished study shared by its authors with the Associated Press this month, relief convoy movements have remained non-communicable and completely stand still since August 24th on the UN said this week. The chair and the ranking member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee wrote with several colleagues in an open letter to Ethiopia's prime minister this week, urging a cessation of hostilities, unfettered humanitarian access ahead of and for the duration of these ongoing negotiations. Observers say that achieving a truce will be challenging given the ongoing federal and the Eritrean military offensive in Tigray, and Eritrea, which is not amongst these talks, is seen as a spoiler now and the main force driving this ongoing conflict. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken yesterday released a statement urging the delegations to engage in seriously taking the talks to reach a lasting resolution to this ongoing conflict. He goes and says, as a first priority, it is essential to achieve an immediate cessation of hostilities, and further adding that calling on the delegation to agree on the unhindered delivery of humanitarian assistance to all of those in need, measures to protect civilians, and Eritrea's complete withdrawal from northern Ethiopia. The meeting in Pretoria is the first public dialogue between the two sides, and according to a Western official, previous secret contacts organized by the United States that took place in Seychelles and twice in Djibouti as well. As to what the Ethiopian government is seeking out of the negotiations, however, is far removed from the reality that's taking place on the ground, as political analyst, professor of history at James Madison University, Etana Dinka had to say. Let's take a listen.
It's very unfortunate, and it's nearly 2 years that Ethiopia is using the humanitarian aid as a play card, which should not be a condition at all. Just a few days ago, authorities in Addis Ababa urged Tigrayans to migrate to areas under control of Eritrea and Ethiopia, which means we do not allow aid unless we control Tigray, and which is going to be another serious difficulty in the negotiation. So the foreign minister just a few days ago said, Dammaka Makonnen said that Tigray should not be allowed. He used the word the TPLF, which is an indirect reference to Tigray, in fact, because the entire Tigray population is practically in war because the civilians are even not allowed to get aid. So he said Tigray should not be allowed to be rearmed. It should be disarmed effectively. If you take this seriously, it means that Addis Ababa is going to the negotiation table only to secure the surrender and the humiliation of Tigray, which is unlikely to achieve, of course.
As Itana said, what the Ethiopian government is coming to the talks with, the Tigray government representative in Europe, Aklilu Haile Mikhail, summed up the position of the Tigrayan government. Let's take a listen.
And we expect results in 4 areas. The first is unconditional and immediate cessation of hostilities. Actually, I've been saying this in a statement that we issued on September 11th. Secondly, the recent resumption of the fighting has resulted in a new wave of internally displaced people. Around 1 million additional people have been displaced because of the fighting. So we expect there will be unfettered humanitarian access to people who live in areas controlled by the allied forces as well as by the Ethiopian government, by the Tigray government. Thirdly, atrocities are taking place inside cities and other areas that are controlled by the allied forces. So we would like international human rights institutions as well as international media to come in and observe those atrocities. And fourthly, the situation of hostilities cannot work if Eritrea does not withdraw. You can't have an effective situation of hostilities implemented without a third party that is already actively participating in the conflict being drawn out of the conflict itself. So we expect Eritrea will withdraw if the situation of hostility is signed.
As the conversations continue in South Africa, a following meeting on Friday by the AU Peace and Security Council, which in a statement called for an immediate, comprehensive, and unconditional ceasefire and the resumption of complete humanitarian services. On the same day, the UN Security Council held a closed meeting requested by the A3 members of the Council, Gabon, Ghana, and Kenya, by failed to issue a statement. After that, the U.S. ambassador to the UN Secretary Council, Linda Thomas Greenfield, made the following remarks. Let's take a listen.
It is past time for your Eritrean defense forces to halt their joint military offensive and for Ethiopia to ask Eritrea to withdraw its soldiers from northern Ethiopia. It is critical that all of the parties seize this opportunity and engage seriously in talks to bring an end to the fighting and the suffering of the Ethiopian people. Once the fighting stops, and it must, warring parties must negotiate concrete modalities to prevent a return to conflict, including security arrangements, a pathway to broader political dialogue, and assurances of unhindered humanitarian access and restoration of services. I can tell you that the United States is fully and actively engaged in diplomatic efforts at the highest levels of our government to support the African Union. The United States remains prepared to take appropriate measures against those who obstruct a resolution of this conflict, and we're determined to have those who commit human rights abuses held to account. Let me be clear, there is no military solution to this conflict. The only path forward is for the parties to pursue a negotiated settlement through peace talks. And we must prevent the region from spiraling further out of control. There's no time to waste. Thank you very much.
The U.S. State Department spokesperson Ned Price, responding to a question regarding a state-led demonstration in Addis Ababa, denouncing what they called an interference by countries like the U.S., and he had this to say in response.
Our response, of course, is that those claims are wholly inaccurate. They are wholly wrong. The interest of the United States is the interest of the Ethiopian people, to see the restoration of peace, to see an end to the violence, to see a sovereign, whole Ethiopia. And that's why we've supported the African Union-led talks. And tomorrow, in fact, these African Union-led talks will kick off in South Africa to address the ongoing conflict in northern Ethiopia that has cost so many lives, has led to atrocities, has led to bloodshed, has led to starvation, has aggravated so many underlying factors. We commend South Africa for hosting the talks. We stand ready to support the African Union High Representative Obasanjo and the AU panel members, former South African Deputy Prime Minister Labo Puka, and former Kenyan President Kenyatta in facilitating in an agreement. And to that end, our special envoy for the Horn of Africa, Mike Hammer, is in South Africa to observe and to participate in the AU-led talks along with United Nations and IGAD, and to support efforts to have an immediate cessation of hostilities, to deliver humanitarian assistance to all Ethiopians in need, to prevent further human rights abuses and atrocities, and to secure Eritrea's withdrawal from northern Ethiopia. Those are our interests, but importantly, those are also the interests of the Ethiopian people.
More updates coming to you from TMH as we present our English Daily News after this quick break.
Situation in Tigray today is unacceptable and has to change.
Do you envision peacekeepers?
At this point, we have two other challenges that go to the security piece. One is we have, as you know, forces from Eritrea that are there, and we have forces from an adjoining region, Amara, that are there. They need to come out, and a force that will not abuse the human rights of the people of Tigray or commit acts of ethnic cleansing, which we've seen in Western Tigray, that has to stop.
The world focuses on Ukraine, but 500,000 people have died in Tigray. I commend you for your visit to Ukraine. I hope that we pay, if not equal, at least more attention to Tigray. The Ethiopian and Eritrean governments are using starvation as a weapon. And the World Food Program says that 90% of the people there need assistance.
There's been a gruesome war underway in Ethiopia for a couple of years now. It's again in progress as we speak. Tens of thousands of women have been raped by militiamen, many of them intentionally infected with AIDS. Can it get worse than that?
For me, particularly the news of the violence against the women is incredible and something that probably not has happened in any wars or conflict in that region. Maybe a word about what is the aim of Ethiopia. When I met the Ethiopian leadership in February, they really used this kind of language that they are going to destroy the Tigrayans, they are going to wipe out the Tigrayans for 100 years and so forth, which for me referred to very serious human rights atrocities and crimes as well. If you wipe out your national minority, what is it? You cannot destroy all the people. You cannot destroy all the population in Tigray, and I think that's very obvious that we have to react and because it looks for us like an ethnic cleansing.
Welcome back to TMH English Daily News. Our next update, the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum warns a heightened risk of genocide. Further mass atrocities continue within the Tigray region. And according to the statement the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum released today, the situation has deteriorated exponentially as Ethiopian security forces, supported by Eritrean forces and Amhara special forces, have seized key towns and cities, imperiling the vulnerable Tigrayan civilians. As we warned a year ago, they said, multiple warning signs of potential genocide against the Tigrayan people are present. Reports of massacres and others targeted killings of Tigrayan civilians, dehumanization, and hate speech amplified on social media, encouraging violence against members of the group, mass arrests, arbitrary detentions, and possible collective punishment in the form of a human-made famine in the Tigray region, as the statement noted. The U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum said that these risks have also heightened, adding that its early warning projects has consistently ranked Ethiopia as one of the 10 of highest risk countries in the world for a new onset of mass killings. Naomi Kekoler, director of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, Simon Skoch, who's the center of the prevention of genocide, stated, while the focus of the policymakers have been elsewhere, close to 500,000 people and are reported to have been murdered for dying as a result of forced starvation. Tigrayan women and girls have suffered widespread sexual violence, including rape, gang rape, and sexual mutilation. The commission of these mass atrocity crimes and the failure to prevent them or protect civilians thus far is a stain on our human conscience, as the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum stressed within their statement. It also added that parties to the conflict must immediately cease the targeting of civilians and seek a resolution to the conflict, and also added that every effort needs to be made to reduce the capacity of the imposed costs on those who commit these ongoing atrocities. As the U.S. urges that it uses all of its leverage to end the killing in Ethiopia, as the international community, referring to the chances of a breakthrough in the talks, director of the World Peace Foundation, Alex de Waal, said that there's a real chance to end the killing within the Tigray region. In an article he wrote titled, "Will the U.S. use its leverage now to end the killings in Ethiopia?" He adds much depends on how tough the AU mediators and their international partners, especially the U.S., are prepared to be. Alex de Waal noted that the successes of Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed in a dominating a narrative among the diplomatic communities in the Addis Ababa areas appears to have blinded him to his vulnerabilities. According to de Waal, the African group at the UN Security Council, the A3, on the Friday drafted a statement that expressed grave concern about the hostilities and humanitarian crisis, continuing that this was blocked by Russia and China at Ethiopia's instigation. Until that point, all of them had optimistically assumed that the P2 would follow the African-led, and the Kenyan representative challenged them, demanding to know why they opposed an African position on an action almost without any precedent. Reportedly, neither gave a confident answer, and Alex de Waal also said that writing explains how Ethiopia's tactical success in blocking the Security Council statement is a strategic failure. It poses the question, why is it ready to risk its relations with Africa for the sake of Russia and China? And in turn, this raises the issue of whether Eritrean President Isaias Afwerki, Russia's most steadfast African ally, is calling the shots after all. Congressional pressure is mounting for a tougher U.S. stand against those responsible for the atrocities, along with the harsher measures against Eritrea, and the U.S. strategy for atrocity prevention was dated in July of this year, and senior figures are calling for it to be activated immediately. The AU and Ethiopia have also angered the European Union. Offended by the principled stand taken by the High Representative, Josep Borrell, the AU didn't invite the EU to be an observer at the peace talks. This is a brazen move, says Alex de Waal. As the EU is not only the largest and most loyal founder of the AU Commission, its peace operations, but Europe has an obvious vested interest in constraining the adventures of the world's most prolific generators of refugees, Isaias. Abiy's plan had been that joint Eritrean and Ethiopian forces would occupy the Tigrayan capital, Mekelle, and he would declare the war over before the talks even started. Alex de Waal says that the battlefield isn't running to his timetable, and writing that the Ethiopian Prime Minister will pay a high price for reputing the Eritrean despot, but a higher one for turning away from his last chance for peace, and stressed that the U.S. and Europeans can impose high costs on Ethiopia, on Abiy, if he refuses to declare a cessation of hostilities within the coming days. Amnesty International says fears of fresh atrocities are looming in Tigray as conflict intensifies. Amnesty International released a statement today in which it said parties to the ongoing conflict must protect their civilians. The Ethiopian government said on Tuesday its army had captured the major town of Shara in northwestern Tigray, which hosts thousands of forcibly displaced Tigrayans, as well as Almata and Korem in south of the region. The government said that it is trying to minimize civilian casualties by avoiding urban fighting, instructing their forces to follow strict rules of engagement. Reports received by Amnesty International, however, believe this claim is false. Muleya Muandai, Amnesty International's director for East Southern Africa, reported that Tigrayan civilians are afraid that the widespread abuses, such as unlawful killings, sexual violence, and systematic attacks that weren't rampant when the Ethiopian National Defense Forces and its allied forces were in control of these areas from November 2020 all the way to June of 2021, which might happen again. In August and September, multiple airstrikes in Ma'ala and Adidaro killed hundreds of civilians, including children, between the 6th and the 12th of September 2022. The Eritrean army, which is allied with the Ethiopian army, extrajudicially executed 40 people, including Eritrean refugees, in Shararo town. The Amnesty International director said the military and civilian officials must recognize their duty to prevent and prosecute war crimes committed by their forces. Failure to do so only implicates them in these crimes. Amnesty International noted that it has been in this conflict that impunity for previous atrocities will only embolden security forces to commit more heinous crimes, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Amnesty International said Ethiopian authorities must suspend and remove from active duty to all of those, including the Eritrean army and Amhara militia, implicated in human rights violations, war crimes, and to make sure that they ensure an immediately investigated report, and added that anyone against whom there's sufficient admissible evidence of responsibility for crimes should be prosecuted in fair trials as well. Promise short of concrete actions will not protect civilians, she said. Amnesty International is also calling on Ethiopian authorities to allow unhindered access to the Tigray region so that impartial and effective humanitarian relief can be delivered. The international human rights body called on Ethiopian authorities to allow international, regional, and other human rights mechanisms to conduct independent and credible investigations on past and present atrocities in northern Ethiopian conflict. As we move on to our final update for today in other news, the African group at the UN Security Council met today with the Commissioner of the International Commission of Human Rights Experts on Ethiopia and the Special Rapporteur of the situation on the human rights in Myanmar. At the A3 was briefed on the alarming abuses against civilians reported to the UN Human Rights Council that's taking place in both situations and in both regions. That concludes our news for today. Thank you so much for tuning in. Bye-bye.